Greeting, Rebel Spirit listeners. I know this is a little unusual. I normally don't speak or record anything before episodes, but I felt that I should give you a little bit of a heads up that there was a audio issue with the interview with Angel Millar. There was quite a bit of reverb and echo on his part of the recording, and it didn't seem so bad when we were actually recording. I've spent the past few weeks trying to remove both the reverb and the echo, and I was able to remove quite a bit, but not all of it. So I wanted to ask you for your patience and forgiveness. I hope that you still listen to this episode. I think that what Angel has to say is full of wisdom and insight, and I really did enjoy speaking with him. So thank you, constant listeners, for your patience, and here is episode 21 of Rebel Spirit Radio. Welcome to Rebel Spirit Radio, exploring the frontiers of spirituality, consciousness, the esoteric, and humanity's sacred relationship with the living earth. I'm your host, Nick Mather, and in this episode, I speak with Angel Millar, author of several books, including The 3 Stages of Initiatic Spirituality, Craftsman, Warrior, Magician, and the recently released The Path of the Warrior Mystic, Being a Man in an Age of Chaos. Angel and I talk about the archetype of the warrior mystic, chivalry and virtue, the need to nurture one's genius, humility as a necessary condition for mastery, and why more generalists are needed to help us see the world through different lenses and make connections specialists often do not see. Angel Millar is the author of several books, including The Crescent and the Compass, Islam, Freemasonry, Esotericism and Revolution in the Modern Age, Freemasonry, Foundation of the Western Esoteric Tradition, Freemasonry, A History, the 2020 publication, The 3 Stages of Initiatic Spirituality, Craftsman, Warrior, Magician, and his most recent publication, The Path of the Warrior Mystic, Being a Man in an Age of Chaos. Angel is also a hypnotist and personal growth mentor with more than 2 decades of experience in meditation and related mindfulness training techniques, over a decade of experience in the martial arts, and several years as a public speaker on self-development, symbolism, and spirituality. Angel, welcome to Rebel Spirit Radio.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes, I'm very much looking forward to speaking with you. I found the Path of the Warrior Mystic, Being a Man in an Age of Chaos, it resonated with me quite a bit. And I really appreciated it. And I liked how you draw from philosophy, myths, psychology, the world's wisdom traditions, especially these classical ideas of virtue and chivalry. I also think it's a very timely book, especially in our current moment where there's a lot of discussion about, so-called toxic masculinity, where masculinity seems to be much maligned. But also, you write at one point that we live in very illusory times. And
Right.
one of the things that kind of came to my mind was Thoreau, who observed, that the massive men lead lives of quiet desperation. And it seems to me that feeds into this sort of toxic masculinity, and that what you're writing is an antidote to all of this, that you're trying to provide a path for men to become whole, integral beings.
Right. Yeah, well, that's exactly right. Yeah, and the path, very briefly, sets out from exploring the warrior and ends with the mystic or the creative individual. And it's really bringing those 2 elements together in this kind of life journey, as it were.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and I was curious because one, the title is The Warrior Mystic. In your previous book, you have, the Craftsman, Warrior, Magician. And how is the Warrior Mystic different? And what is the Warrior Mystic?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, to begin with the three stages, so the craftsman, warrior, magician really go back to the sort of earliest, you could say, castes or vocations in tribal societies, really around the world, but certainly in Indo-European cultures. And it would seem that these were the castes or the vocations that men moved through with becoming a craftsman in the youth. Of course, people didn't go to school until they were 16, 18, 30. They were helping their parents when they were, 4, 5 years old, if not earlier. So originally becoming a craftsman, then when the body matured and they were strong enough, they could become a warrior, part of the defensive force for the tribe. And then later, as the body declined, and that they couldn't fight anymore, but they had wisdom and were still respected for their wisdom and their knowledge, they would become one of the sort of spiritual, intellectual guides of the culture, the Brahmin, the priest, the magician, etc. And so the warrior mystic definitely very much fits into that world, but it's in a sense a kind of different way of looking at it. And all of these things overlap anyway, of course. But if you look at the warrior in classical civilizations, you find that uh, the highest level, the warrior would cultivate not only the arts of war, archery, wrestling, the sword, obviously, spear, but would also be renowned for poetry, painting, calligraphy. And so you have someone like the samurai Miyamoto Musashi, who was not only Japan's most famous samurai, but also is still today renowned for his calligraphy and his painting, was also known for landscape gardening in his own time. Or in the West, you have the Viking Egil Skallagrimsson, who was also an extremely bloodthirsty warrior, but was also a renowned poet during his lifetime. And he actually was the first in Norse poetry to use end rhyme rather than beginning with the first word of each sentence. So he was kind of revolutionary in poetry as well. And even mythologically, you can think of the god Odin. He's the god of war, the wild hunt, but also the god of poetry, inspiration, and magic. So that at some point, all of these things come together. But the warrior mystic is really looking at bringing these two aspects together. And the book begins with a discussion of the warrior, chivalry, and where things have gone wrong for men in the modern age. But it ends with a discussion of the mystic. And the mystic has two meanings in this book. I take the term from the British historian Arnold Toynbee, who used the term mystic to mean, on the one hand, the kind of creator, the creative force in society, and on the other hand, the sort of mystic who receives a revelation. So on the one hand, you would have someone like Muhammad who receives this revelation and transforms Arabic society as a consequence of that. He would definitely fit into that archetype. But also, you could think in terms of the creator, Picasso, who revolutionizes the art world, in a certain sense, brings back the archetypal with some of his later work. And brings a kind of new message to society and a new way of thinking about things. And this is off at a tangent, but I'll just mention it. Toynbee considers the difference between the sort of tribal society or quote unquote primitive society, which preserves itself in amber as compared to civilization. And of course, there are still remaining, not very well known, but a few tribes here and there who have been totally cut off from civilization, the rest of the world in the Amazon jungle, who really have never seen anyone outside of their tribe. And he says the difference is that civilizations have a quote unquote creative minority, and that they always kind of propel the civilization forward. They're the energy of the civilization, whereas the tribe tries to emulate the ancestors, it emulates the dead and what the dead say. And what the dead say goes. It's a sort of repeating of the past. So, in a sense, it's bringing the warrior and the mystic together. You could say it's bringing the masculine and feminine. It's also concerned with developing these different sides within ourselves, but it is also looking at a kind of forward momentum to re-embody the archetypal.
There's a lot I want to say based on that, but or ask you about. One of the first things that came to my mind when you were speaking, and I appreciate this because I hadn't actually thought about it before, but when you were talking about the craftsman, warrior, magician, I think the thing I missed is that it was different stages, I suppose. And when you were speaking, I was thinking specifically about the system of Dharma in India, which you then
Yeah,
brought up to mind. And I think we've definitely lost that, don't have that in our society at all.
right,
And
right.
one of the things I wanted to ask you is, you know, you I started by, mentioning how you said that, we live in illusory times. How did we get so lopsided in our understanding of a warrior? Because
Yeah.
our understanding of warrior does not seem to have this sort of creative aspect or impulse to it.
No, no, that's right. It doesn't. It doesn't indeed. Well, I think probably, I mean, we could go back to the beginnings of time, no doubt, and trace it all the way through. But I think if we really wanted to see where there was a dramatic change, I would say it was really with the introduction of mechanized warfare, and most especially with World War One. And I think World War One has really gone down the memory hole, as if it's just a sort of unimportant prelude to World War II, which was really important. And I think that's completely false, actually, and it's really historically ignorant. World War One. Americans can't really appreciate this, but really entire areas, if not entire cities, were wiped out. You had no man's land, which was really just nature just turned into this muddy desert where everything was dead and trenches were dug in it for miles or tens of miles or hundreds of miles, just a wasteland. And millions of men were sent to die mechanistically, almost in a kind of factory conveyor belt like way. This is a stunning fact, and I think we're very keen to know some facts or some statistics in our age and not others. And I think this statistic is really worth thinking about. On day one of the Battle of the Somme, the British troops alone lost 20,000 men. 20,000 men were killed on one side in one day, and 40,000 were injured. And that's just in one day. And, you wonder how on earth can 20,000 men be killed in one day? And of course, the way they were killed is they're really, told or instructed or ordered, you've got to run across to where the enemy is, and they're going to mow you down. But that's okay because we've got to run those bullets out, and they're going to do it on you, and we don't care because that's the only way to create an opening. And 20,000 men are expendable, and I think that's really what changed the world. One of several things, but certainly that was a big factor because on all sides, this was going to be a glorious war, a kind of maybe not an aristocratic war, but they still had this feeling of chivalry. Men fighting as men against each other in a fair kind of sporting combat. And actually, what they found, they were just being mowed down with machine guns. The machines were doing all the work, and they were completely defenseless against this. And of course, they went home afterwards, or they didn't go home. But those that did went home with limbs missing or face ripped off or suffering from mustard gas attacks and barely able to breathe. And it was traumatic. And they lost, every side lost millions of men like that. And of course, another thing that happens with that is then you have women that never get married. And of course, women today would say, well, what's the big deal? But the big deal then was that society functioned in such a way that you really needed the family unit to survive. There wasn't things like, a generous welfare state that could enable you to survive as an individual, even with, as a single parent with 10 children, you would be on the streets and probably dead in no time at all. And, even the British soldiers that went there were, many of them were unfit to go there. Kinds of disease and ill health. The social structure just didn't exist as it does today. So, not getting married for women would actually be pretty devastating for most women at that time. And obviously, if you're being killed or maimed or you're wounded or traumatized, or you see 20,000 of your comrades being killed, that's pretty bad for you too. And that really shook up, I think, the way that the West saw itself and saw war as well. You had the pacifist movement as a result, and pacifism became this big thing after World War One. And pacifism was regarded as the answer. We're all going to be pacifists. There'll be no more war. World War One was the wars to end all wars, of course. That was repeated frequently, and then you have World War Two, and pacifism failed as well. So, but I think really with that, you have the end of the idea of the warrior because of this mechanistic element, the ability to just mow men down en masse or bomb them with mustard gas and destroy entire units, if not entire armies in one go. It was no longer a sort of fair fight, no longer a skill of the body even. So.
I think that in the United States, we do lack that history. Like you said, it's down the memory hole.
Yeah.
In Europe, you still have the physical scars of the trenches that mark the land.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I would say, even in England, I think most young people don't even, or a lot of young people don't even know that there was a World War One or anything about it. But yeah, so the historical ignorance, Americans love to think that they're the most ignorant, but actually, there's not much between the other Western countries. But certainly growing up, if you walk around London even now and you pass by some of the older buildings there, some of the older museums, they have a lot of chunks out of the side of the building, like bullet holes, which seems to have been caused during World War II. So, with raids on London.
Right.
So we do have some physical scars, and obviously, some of these cities were flattened. I mean, Dresden was reduced to a firestorm. It's completely horrific, and other cities were as well. So,
Yeah. Yeah, that's something that, Americans in general have never experienced. I mean, yes, we fought in World War One and World War
Mhm.
II, but not necessarily on our shores. Even
That's right.
Pearl Harbor is removed from the
Mhm.
rest of the continent.
Yeah,
I think your point is really good about the mechanism, or this mechanical way of viewing humans, because that was
mhm.
very obvious in World War II as well with the
Yeah,
concentration
yeah,
camps. I mean, those were
mhm.
models of efficiency.
Yeah,
And it seems like that I think it's very difficult to argue against the idea that this mechanization has robbed us of something very valuable in terms of being human.
yeah, that's right. Absolutely. Yeah, oh, absolutely. And of course, with all the conveniences we have today, we're speaking using technology, which is a wonderful thing. But the downside is, I think we are losing our humanity even more. Even though these things are sold to us as conveniences, then they become essential for work, like cell phone, for example, or email. No one can get a job without those today. That were originally things for convenience, and you know, and more and more people are getting sucked into spending their entire lives online, arguing with people they don't know, knowing that they're not speaking truthfully, they're just trying to win in some weird way,
Yeah.
and not even seeing the other side as human. They see them as dehumanized or unhuman in some way.
Yeah, and that's something I wanted to bring up because you did write at one point, you cautioned us to, avoid arguing with the unintelligent and vulgar, which I thought was a really good piece of advice. My note
Yeah.
was, so essentially stay off of social media, right?
Oh yeah, at least don't get into any arguments. And it's so tempting, of course, because when you see somebody say something really ignorant, whether it's something, you know, on, let's say, politically on your side or the other side, it's so tempting, at least certainly on the other side, so tempting to really want to criticize that and show, no, that's just completely ignorant. The problem, of course, is when people post those comments, they know that they're false 99% of the time. Their aim is to win, it's to get likes, it's not to say something truthful. People are very happy lying. And I know that this is maybe a weird thing to say, but I think the way to look at that is we don't really have fashions anymore, like skinhead or punk or goth or hip hop. But when we did have those things, and we're probably both old enough to remember them. But when we did have those things, of course, it would be a craze. People would wear them for a few years, and then all of a sudden, people would stop. And the weird thing is that people would wear it even if it didn't suit them. And you think, why don't you wear clothes that you would look good in rather than wearing these other clothes that you don't look good in? And today, politics is our fashion, and we do the same thing. Instead of saying the truth, we say what would make us conform to other people to get an applause temporarily, and then later on we'll pretend we didn't say it at all. And it is a weird thing that people are prepared to dumb themselves down, either physically or mentally, to conform. But even weirder today, when people try and conform intellectually by saying something stupid or untrue, they actually feel that that makes them more intelligent because the group is there to support them and applaud them. So it's a very dangerous time for the mind, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And, the only thing I would disagree with what you just said is that I do think that some people are posting things not necessarily because they know that they're false, but that they just don't know that there is, the being an educator. I can tell you that I've been shocked at what students come into my class not knowing just basic things. And so I'll see people post things on Facebook that are just obviously incorrect. And I have taken to, there is that part of me that wants to go in and say, no, 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 this is not factually correct and things like that. And if you just stopped and thought about it for a second, you would see this. But I don't. But that educator part of me wants to go in. But I know it doesn't go anywhere because, like you said, people get so attached, and it has become, the clothes that we wear. It has become the signifier for who we are.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Because this leads to another question or something I wanted to talk about is this idea of the warrior and the intellect. And that seems to be something that we've also disconnected from. But the intellectual virtues are important every bit to the warrior as to the rest of us.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that warriors are intellectuals, but they certainly have some way of, well, if you go back to the medieval period, so they didn't think of thinking in the same way that we think of thinking. Today we think that we are rational, although we are not rational by about 99% of the time. We know that because you have to look at adverts and see how things are sold to us. They're not sold to us. Here's a fizzy drink. Here are the ingredients. You can weigh up the health hazards with the flavor. It's images of smiling people who are attractive usually, or have the same kind of body shape that we might. Happy music, and we want to associate with the cool people as well by that fizzy drink. And everything is sold to us like that. So we're clearly not rational because marketers would have worked that out and would be selling us things on the basis of their intellectual arguments. But in the medieval period, they had the idea of ratio and intellectus. And ratio was the rational thinking. It was considered to be the workhorse of the mind. It was kind of the inferior way of thinking. There's the problem, I have to fix it, so I use ratio to fix it, to come to the conclusion. And then there's intellectus, which is contemplation. So if I'm contemplating a tree or nature or a landscape, I'm absorbing the divine truth in a sense. The creator created the world. In some sense, it embodies the divine mind, the divine plan. And by by contemplating it, not making any rational judgments about it, but contemplating it, I'm sort of absorbing this divine nature. And today, of course, we can think about the mind in different ways, not just as rational thinking, but we're moving through different states of consciousness all the time. Sleep, hypnopompia, when we're starting to wake up, maybe rational thinking, probably not much of the time. Daydreaming, relaxation, we're drifting in and out, meditation, all kinds of things, all kinds of states of consciousness that we don't really use. But the warrior would use at least some of these states of consciousness and would have these other ways of thinking, contemplating different scripture. Obviously, a Christian knight would have contemplated the Bible, probably would have known it, off by heart in many cases. Certainly in Islam, an Islamic warrior would have known the Quran possibly by heart from beginning to end. Certainly, if you go back to the Vedic India, they would have known the Vedas, or at least large parts of the Vedas. Zen Buddhism, of course, maybe not so focused on scripture, but still focused on the idea of absolute being in a certain sense. And so they have a different frame of reference to the world and a different way of thinking about the world. And again, if you are any kind of martial artist, you're going to have to be controlling your mind, your thoughts, your consciousness. You have to experience flow occasionally, as we call it today, or no mind, as it would be called in Zen Buddhism. So certainly this is all a part of it. I think intellect, as we use it today, it's a little too specific and limited, but certainly there's broad world of sort of consciousness and being and understanding that went along with the warrior, for sure.
Thank you for clarifying that, because I was thinking that, and I think you mentioned this in the book, that we tend to make this dichotomy of separating the warrior and from those who would, write poetry and have this different rationality, and those who focus on intellectual matters are seen as being more, passive and feminine, and we focus on the others as just lacking any of that. And again, I think what you're arguing is for that integration of the two.
Yeah, right. And classically speaking, that was the case. Ego Skagrimson, Viking, also a renowned poet, Miyamoto Musashi, even Plato spoke about learning through music, philosophy, and wrestling. And he actually said that those who study wrestling become too feminine, too sensitive, and those who just study wrestling, study music, become too sensitive. Those who study wrestling become too hard and aggressive and harsh. And so you have to marry the two. And this is the case going back hundreds, thousands of years, and it's only, I think, in modernity that they've really been separated, and you get this kind of jock culture and you get the geek culture, and they're really, in a sense, they're both half of people, or half of a person each, because the jock probably is perfectly capable of being intelligent, thinking, contemplating, writing poetry, not necessarily that, but doing something creative. And the geek is also capable of working out and being fit, learning some kind of self-defense maybe, or something, but being physically strong in some way. And it's almost kind of weird that why wouldn't you want to develop yourself as a whole? And Western society, probably for many decades, is trying to push us into this way of thinking that, no, if you're an athlete, you're going to be tough and you're going to be dumb. And if you're an intellectual guy, you're I don't know, computer engineer or something, just make sure you're skinny and you're weak and you can't defend yourself. And so why are we thinking like this? Or in even worse, well, not worse, but parallels this, if you listen to a lot of sort of career gurus and marketing gurus, they say, find a niche, find the smallest niche you can, and then find a niche within that niche so you're the expert in this tiny little field. So all of us are trying to be made sort of very niche, but we're actually a mind, a body, spirit, and we should be developing ourselves as a whole. And I would say that it's becoming a little more recognized now that as we move forward into the 21st century, we're actually going to all need to be a lot more generalists. And I'm not saying that that's what I'm promoting, but if you are a warrior and a mystic or a creative person and a physically strong person, and you can see the world through these different lenses, that's much more in line with the generalist than a specialist. It's important.
Yeah, that's something I wanted to ask you about anyway. This idea of generalization versus specialization. It's something that I've personally run into quite a bit, having existed my almost entire adult life in academia.
Right.
Academia, it is exactly what you said. It's like, you specialize, you focus. And, even when you get through the PhD, it is, you are the master of just a tiny little speck in the and my experience has been rather different, because I am all over the place. I would actually consider myself a generalist, but that has not worked to my advantage in terms of employment so much.
Right.
A little bit, but I like what you wrote. I think you said something is that, when we're generalist, we can connect the dots. Whereas when we specify, our specialists, we're just focused on one dot.
Right.
It seems to me that's exactly what we need to do right now, is we need to start connecting the dots.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And again, it's probably another reason for many of the problems that we have in society, that none of the dots are connected. And, we all feel, it seems, or a large section of society feels, apparently, that if we keep criticizing, complaining, and shouting, that this somehow will magically create solutions, or that the politicians that we don't trust will magically create solutions for us, which I think is the most absurd way of thinking imaginable. But actually, any solutions will come from creativity, and creativity comes generally when you have a good understanding of something, you have good technical skills in something, if it requires that, and you have a broad knowledge or wide knowledge of things, and then things will spark your imagination. Oh, that's like something else that nobody else would have thought, because I saw that, at the weekend, or that reminds me of something in a different field that I once saw, and then you kind of can create something new. But if we're stuck in a niche where nothing new will really occur, we'll just keep going down a particular tunnel, unconnected to other things, which is going to prove very unhelpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. You mentioned this idea that, we like to critique things. And I think, we also like to play the victim. And you wrote that we need to kill our inner victims.
Yes.
And I agree with that. And, I have people that I love deeply that tend to do that. And I've fallen to that pattern as well. It's saying, this whole system, is feeling trapped, right? But, why do you think that we like to see ourselves as victims, and how can we kill our inner victim?
Yeah, well, I think one of the reasons we like to see ourselves as a victim is that no matter where we are in the sort of ladder of society or in the food chain, if I'm a victim, I'm automatically more important than where I actually am. So if I'm a millionaire and I say I've been wronged by society, well, then I should be a billionaire. That's actually naturally where I should be. It's just I've been held down, so I'm only a millionaire. If I'm a billionaire, I could be a multi-billionaire. That's where I should be, but the society is held me down. And people might be thinking, well, billionaires don't think that, or millionaires don't think that. Well, take a look at celebrities. All of them are on Twitter saying how hard done by they are, how hurt they are, how life has been difficult for them. And I'm not saying it hasn't, because actually, if you look at celebrities, they often have had illnesses or grow up in poverty and so on. But what they complain about seems to be very much in line with contemporary politics and often more about getting a pat on the back than actually anything that they might really have experienced. But I think this inner victim, it makes us feel that actually we're much more important than we should be, than we are right now, and it's just unfair. And I'm sure you've experienced this, not in terms of the victim, but you walk into a bar and in the middle of nowhere, some guy will be telling you about what the president should be doing. All he does is go to a bar every night and work in, some blue collar job, which is fine, but he probably doesn't really have the qualifications to say what the president should do.
You've mentioned, and this is a core theme in the book, chivalry. And I was reading your book as well as coming from a place of virtue theory, from how I understand it. So why don't we look at chivalry and virtue and how you understand those, how you're defining them?
Yeah. So, chivalry and virtue. Well, so chivalry, C.S. Lewis talks about this double demand that's placed on the chivalrous, on the knight. And he says, the knight must be fierce in battle, but meek in civil society. And he notes that not all warriors are able to accomplish this. So, in a sense, it is being able to face the worst and most violent and aggressive and threatening of times with some kind of composure. And I think that's a word that slipped from our consciousness, but to face things with composure, but also not to use this force that the individual, the knight, the warrior possesses to get his way with the innocent or women or whatever it might be. Obviously, atrocities are committed against men, women, and children in wars. And I think we all know about that. But one would not say that that is chivalrous, besides being a war crime in modern times. I don't think that chivalry has never allowed such behavior. So on the one hand, it is being brave, meeting certainly an enemy, meeting the potential of being maimed or the potential of death, which is very real for the warrior, with composure and really not thinking that much about life, in a sense, not trying to hold on to life. Yeah, of course, trying to win and trying to defeat the enemy, but not really sort of loving life in itself, really always being sort of focused on death and beyond death. And then, and when you come in contact with innocent people, either in your civilization or the one you might be fighting, really treating them with respect, so not abusing those who can't fight or are physically weak and don't pose a threat to you, and treating them with respect. So certainly respect for the enemy would be one virtue that one could find within chivalry, and certainly there are others. Hospitality was part of chivalry, both Christian and Islamic, of course, and other cultures. Pre-Christian Northern European hospitality was a very big deal. So I think that would be a sort of basic foundation.
Yeah, I was curious. I wanted to see if I could get any insight into chivalry by looking at the etymology of the word. And all I could really find was that it is connected to a sort of the culture, I guess, or society,
Right.
or caste of knights.
Yeah.
And so it is this sort of moral code of sorts.
Yeah. And I suppose that, the big difference between that and a regular sort of warrior code, let's say from even earlier periods when perhaps there weren't quite as many rules governing things. I think the big difference would be this really attempt to treat the innocent fairly and respectfully, and also this idea that the knighthood is itself or the warrior is in some way connected to greater culture. So even Richard the Lionheart, who was always on crusades, of course, he is supposed to have invited musicians from his enemy Saladin's camp to come and play Islamic music for him. And he was also supposed to have loved it. Now, that may be not entirely provable, but it certainly fits in with the idea of chivalry, that there's an appreciation for the arts, an appreciation for non-combatants, and for culture and civilization in general, even though you may be fighting the other person or the other side.
So that was chivalry. So let's
Mm.
turn our attention to virtue. I think that there has been this for a long while now, this idea of making virtue, it's been kind of feminized in many ways. I
Mhm.
think.
Yeah, right.
But virtue had a different meaning. So
Mhm.
I was wondering if you could maybe talk about that a little bit.
Sure. So the word virtue etymologically goes back to the word virtus, which means essentially, in a sense, manly, from the word vir, meaning virile. And then, of course, while that was the original meaning, later on, certainly in Victorian society, a virtuous person was a person who refrained from doing manly things, especially fighting. It would be virtuous to walk away from a fight, for example, or by that time, even more especially, to be virtuous was really something that applied to women. Women were virtuous because they were virginal and pure and didn't have these wicked thoughts that men had. So it was sort of an anti-masculinity term in a sense, or tinged with anti-masculinity. So it's a complete inversion to the original. And certainly in the modern era, it would seem to me that maybe certainly partly because of World War I and other things, or the very much accelerating in our own time. Now we can virtually think of no virtues that a man might have, and men are often regarded as, in a sense, the kind of inferior women or women that went wrong somehow, and we're all female in the womb, and then there's a mutation that gets men, and men must be somehow bad. It's a very strange time that we live in. Anything masculine is regarded as toxic and in need of being policed, by society in some way. So,
Right. And I think it's so crucial, though, to have a healthy understanding of masculinity and models of that.
Mhm.
So that's one of the reasons I really appreciated your book. And as I said to you before we began recording, virtue theory has been one of the areas that I have spent quite a bit of time researching and studying. And I've been shouting from the rooftops as much as I can that we
Mhm.
need a return to virtue. And I
Mhm.
know I'm not alone in this.
Mhm.
I know that the philosopher Nietzsche kind of
Mhm.
argued something similar. And I wanted to ask you
Right.
about
Yeah.
Nietzsche, if he'd been a
Mhm.
influence on you. I know he appears a couple times in the book.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and certainly I read Nietzsche quite a lot when I was younger, and he definitely is an influence, and somebody that, although I rarely sit down and read Nietzsche from cover to cover anymore, and certainly is somewhere in the psyche and somebody that I will return to periodically. And I think you can't even really evaluate modern society without Nietzsche.
Right.
The destruction of all values and the creation of new values, but out of what?
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think that with virtue, and I think this is what Nietzsche got is, he was one of the first, I think, to criticize a lot of the modern moral theories, especially
Mhm.
utilitarianism.
Right. Yeah.
And there was a movement that started in the 50s, I think, to say, well, maybe what we need to do is kind of go back to virtue. And
Mhm.
I see it as incredibly important, even politically.
Mhm.
This is the soapbox that I stand on all the time is that,
Mhm.
the United States was founded as a republic, and
Right.
the core idea of any republic is that the citizens and the politicians have to be virtuous.
Right.
And it was
Exactly. Yeah.
always understood that if we weren't, that would lead to the collapse of the republic.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, totally. And you also need an educated citizenship as well that can think, not just consume opinions from the media, but can think, is that correct? Is that true? And be able to think through it and come to their own conclusions. Yeah, we don't have a lot of either of that, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, and you talk about this a little bit, for the Greeks, the whole point of virtue is to achieve eudaimonia,
Mhm.
right? Which often is
Right.
translated as happiness. Now they're
Mhm.
translating it as, I think, flourishing. But
Mhm.
I always think of it in terms of like having a good spirit, but you
Right.
define
The
it
daemon.
as,
Yeah.
yeah, having a good genius.
Right.
Good genius. What does that mean? What does having a good genius mean?
Yeah, yeah. So the genius would be the daemon, obviously. This sort of this voice within us that is really our true self in a sense. And or we might say our potential. There's something higher than us that is us. Obviously it's a little difficult to describe, but the way that we can bring this daemon or the genius out is, I think, through usually through mastering some kind of skill, whether it's a martial art or painting or poetry or something else, but typically something where we have to be inventive and creative, learning a skill, letting it master us, and letting it mold us, and sometimes that molding our body quite literally, especially if it's a physical art. There will be physical changes, but then at some point you go beyond the teachings and you manifest something that has not been seen before, but is at the same time, I think, if it's true, is archetypal or classical in some kind of new form. And the Khalil Gibran, the Lebanese poet, said, I paraphrase slightly, but at the end of the prophet, he says, if anything I've said is true, someone else will come again and say it in new words. And I think the genius is manifesting this truth that classical civilizations and others have known about, manifested, and you kind of re-manifest it in a way that's right for today. And that's a difficult thing because, especially in our society, we're kind of extremists, and we go from left to right. We believe this one year, then the next year, even if the political sides haven't changed, next year we might say, no, that's hate now. We're on to some other new thing, or some new group is obsessing us, and then who cares about that? But we're on to something else. I mean, it's constantly shifting. And so it's almost impossible to be consistent and stay with the mainstream narrative unless you deny you said all those other things before. And genius is, in a sense, you have to ignore all of that, learn something, become a master in it, and push beyond what's been done before. And when you manifest something new that is nevertheless timeless, I think that is the genius, or that's the genius being expressed in some way, the daemon.
Yeah, it kind of takes me back to what we were discussing a little bit ago, in terms of sort of the identity politics and whatnot. And it seems to me often that all of these trappings of identity, that we're always looking outside of ourselves,
Yeah.
we are. And this idea of the genius is, no, you have to go within and really find who you are.
Yeah, you go within, and there's sort of a meeting point in religious terms between you and the deity, right? Which is not necessarily receiving a revelation as such. Although you could say a poet might be inspired, that will be the daemon or the genius who's inspired, who flows out of him. And and I'm not saying this. I'm not trying to elevate myself, but definitely at times when I'm writing, and I think a lot of experienced people find this occurs when I'm writing. Sometimes it just seems to be flowing. I mean, other times maybe not, but sometimes it's just I just write and that's it. And it's all pretty much perfect. And other times, no. But that experience of it just flowing, or the flow, is that daemon. So it's going within, but also, in a sense, it's this meeting point of you and divinity, or you and something higher that we can't quite grasp the meaning of, that we call God, or the spiritual, or something like that, or the Tao, or whatever it may be, or no mind in Zen Buddhism, for example. So you're both going within and then contacting something that is ever present or beyond us, or however we might think of it. So it's a kind of weird thing that happens.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I am working through a book. I shouldn't even mention it because I don't know if I can remember the title, but it's about writing. But that's the main point that the author is trying to get at, is that for writing, you have to enter that state of flow.
Yeah. Yeah. And obviously that takes a long time. You can't really, you can't experience that after a month or 6 months or a year. It's going to be probably more like 10 years. And obviously you can experience this in other things as well, certainly in martial arts, painting, or dance, definitely. You can experience this flow, and when you experience it, it definitely has this feeling of something beyond me is moving through me. And just in martial arts, for example, there are definitely times when you react, and you kind of consciously you catch up with the reaction after and think, oh wow, how did I block that punch or whatever? Because there was nothing conscious doing that. It's almost like something is moving through you, and that's very much the sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have to get out of our own way, I think.
Yeah, we do. And it's tricky, but that's exactly what we need to do. Yeah.
Yeah. But the things like the martial arts, for example, don't they prepare us for that? Isn't that part of it, is to receive that kind of training? I don't know. I don't practice any kind of martial art.
Preparing in what way?
Just preparing the person to be open to that kind of flow.
One would hope. Yeah, I mean, certainly there's a lot of. It really depends on the martial arts school, and martial arts can be extremely different depending on where you go. So it's difficult to generalize, because you might go to one school and it might be doing slow forms. It might never have any kind of physical contact with anyone. You could go to another school and they're beating each other up for 2 hours at a time, and there's no sense of doing any forms or anything. But yeah, so typically, I mean, definitely there should be some kind of mental training. Certainly, I've done meditation, some what you might regard as self-hypnosis as well, isn't it? And then there are other physical training as well, such as conditioning the body as well. So and repeating drills over and over again to condition the body to move in a certain way as well.
One of the other things I wanted to ask you about is humility. Let's talk about humility, because I think you were saying something just a little bit ago about sort of adopting a position of intellectual humility. And I think that you wrote that it was something like a condition of mastery. And I was wondering if you could speak to this idea of humility, especially in regards to the warrior mystic.
Sure. So I think, we today think of humility as weak, as being a pushover, of always saying, oh no, I'm the worst or whatever. And obviously there are many people who sort of have a sort of fake humility. In the world of spirituality, I've noticed over the years, a lot of people will position themselves as a spiritual teacher, and then at some point they'll say, well, of course, we're all students, which really means they just want to be seen as a master, but also want to be credited as someone who's very humble as well. So this is fake humility. I have this idea which makes sound weird, and I say this slightly tongue-in-cheek, and it is that we want to be humble but not modest. And by that I mean we don't want to go around always giving way to everybody else all the time. But we do want to ask ourselves, is this true? Am I doing my best? When I got angry at that other person, was it really all them? Or did I do something that I could change? Or when, martial arts, somebody may have done something like punch me in the face. Is it really their fault? Or should I have done something different? What could I have done better? And I think humility is sort of asking yourself those questions and always thinking, well, there must be something I can do to be better. And I want to be better, and always wanting to be better, and always thinking that I can be better. And, for myself, I never try to look back too much on what I've done. I'm more interested in what I'm going to do or can do, and I always try to be better. And certainly if you read the writing in my first book and then you read the writing in my last two, it's almost like a different person, because I'm always trying to improve. And I think that you to become a master of anything, you have to have that attitude of, I can always learn from anyone. My aim is to be better than I am now. And certainly when I've been in a martial arts class sometimes, maybe there have been times when I don't really want to be there. And someone will come in who's been practicing just for a couple of months and really giving it 110%. And, then I can think to myself, that person is giving it all they've got. I should probably do the same, and not sort of think that, oh, I've been doing this for years, so I don't need to try. That's arrogance. And to be humble, you can think, yeah, that person has virtually no experience compared to me is doing something right, and I should use that as an example. So you need that to learn, but what you don't want is this sort of false modesty where you position yourself as a spiritual teacher and then I'm just a student after all, to try and seem more humble, so that people would like you even more. Well, and I have to, it's partly my feeling because I grew up in England, and England and America are very different in this sense that America is very much about putting yourself forward, whereas in Britain it's very much more about, we need to play this game where we're all being modest, and then if you compliment me, I'm going to deny the compliment so that you'll say it twice. And Americans are much easier to deal with. You just give them a compliment and they say thanks. So I actually prefer that. But it's difficult for Americans to appreciate this sort of weird old world game playing of modesty, which is sort of weird kind of hierarchical game playing. And you find it in other cultures like Japanese culture as well. So.
Right, for sure. Yeah, this idea of humility I liked quite a bit, in the sense, and what you're just saying is, personally, I try to do the same thing as an instructor, where it's, yes, I have, more education than I probably need, that anyone probably needs. But I don't know everything, and I still learn from my students all the time.
Yeah.
And what I always try to do is, I think what you just said, is to recognize, we're all searching for truth together.
Yeah. I think, it's when you reach a certain point, there's that balance where you have to put your money where your mouth is and say, this is what I stand for, while at the same time being open to accepting new information and thinking about it and absorbing it and changing it if necessary. I think that's the balance that one needs to aim for, really.
Yeah, I think it would be much better if everyone recognized that they could be wrong.
Yeah,
and
right.
That's where I see the humility at. And I also think that maybe this lack of humility gets back to this identity as well. Nope, this is how it is. This is what I think, and this is correct. And the fear of being incorrect is an attack on the individual.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. And I think this is partly because creativity has actually measurably declined over the last 4 decades, and and it's been measured, and it literally is declining. But you don't really need any kind of test or measure to see it's in decline. You only have to look at the culture over the last 40 years, and especially with people in their teens, for example. And okay, sure, there have always been many young people who are not very creative, but within the teens, early 20s of any generation from probably 1950 to 1990, maybe 2000, there were always new fashions, new youth cultures, new creative movements, and you don't find that anymore. People, the coolest music today is probably hip hop and country, which is 40, 50 years old. And you don't have anything equivalent to goth or punk or hip hop or anything like that. And instead of young people sort of, making their own fashions or movements, they're just going online to Twitter and complaining or posting photos on Instagram. And obviously that is less creative. But if you are not very creative, and if your identity is all online, what you tweeted, 5 minutes ago is your equivalent of fashion or whatever it is, then it is your identity. You're not just, when someone criticizes that, they're not just criticizing your opinion on some probably largely irrelevant subject, they're criticizing your identity. And so, it's the problem.
Yeah, and that seems to go, this lack of creativity seems to go hand in hand with a lack of curiosity.
Yeah, there's that is something that's very true of the West. We're really there's a distinct lack of curiosity, and I wasn't alive at that point. But if you think back to the 1960s, when there was real curiosity about Eastern culture, Buddhism, Hinduism, of course, in particular. People were going on the hippie trail. They went through Afghanistan, hung out in Afghanistan, India, of course, Kashmir, and elsewhere. And we're really interested in Eastern cultures, non-Western culture, and many other things, of course, as well. And we're creating art or making their own clothing and things like this. And whereas today, the sort of relationship to non-Western cultures, it's all sort of very hands-off. And we mustn't criticize, but you also mustn't take it on board as well, because that's cultural appropriation, and that's a form of racism, which is the weirdest thing ever, and it's the first time in history why anyone has ever heard that. And cultures influence each other all the time. That's the way cultures evolve. Civilizations influence each other. Even when they're at war, they influence each other. Hence the anecdote about Richard the Lionheart. But so it's very strange, and it's a sort of mental policing. But and this may be, and hopefully not for too much of a tangent. There are all these theories about why, and I don't want to muddy the waters even more. But I partly suspect that for a lot of people, anyway, that this is actually an anti-creativity movement, because you get to critique anyone who creates anything, regardless of what it is. It's not politically correct enough, or it is, and that's cultural appropriation, which is just as bad. You get to criticize that too. And the only people who cannot be critiqued are the people who are who do the critiquing, who don't do anything else. And I think it's maybe compensating, though now people can go online and see all kinds of, or anything essentially, that maybe they feel that they're not really, in a sense, fully in the world, and the way to compensate is to attack anybody who creates anything. So I think it's, in a sense, it's the kind of anti-creativity movement. I mean, it's one reason why it should be ignored.
Yeah, I think that in part, from my experience, I think one of the things that feeds into this is the creation of the internet. A lot of times what I am seeing in students is that, well, they don't need to be curious. They don't need to know anything, because they have Google. They can just look it up and get what they need.
That's right.
And move forward. I also saw this, and this, the first time I saw this, it just, my jaw, I think, hit the floor. I was in a class, and I was covering Socrates, the Apology. And I think it's my favorite passage in all of philosophy. I should have it memorized. I don't know if I do, but it's where Socrates is defending himself and he asks the jury, he's like, why is it that you seem to care so much more for wealth and prestige and honor rather than the greatest improvement of your souls? And I will never forget, I had a student raise her hand, and what she asked, she's like, who was he to judge?
That's a great anecdote. Wow.
All I know is I went on a little rant after that. I don't remember
Yeah.
what my rant was, but I think it was something like, we all need someone to prod us. He was the gadfly to try to get us at our higher selves. And it seems like what you were just saying is that that's like forbidden now.
Yeah, that's right. Well, and of course, she didn't even perceive the irony that she herself, in saying that, is being judgmental.
Right.
Really, it's not a question. It's actually a comment that he is no one to judge, right? He shouldn't be doing it. That's what she's really saying. So I think it is an attack on anyone who does anything creative, and there's also this other element that we must all conform as well. So we don't want anyone who's going to stand out, and very unfortunately, the conformists all think of themselves as very radical and very sort of rebellious, but even though they're all conforming and won't say anything that isn't said on CNN or wherever it may be said. And that's the most unfortunate thing, because people have always conformed, but in the past that sort of attitude was largely restricted to old people that everyone ignored, and young people just got on and lived their lives and were creative and rebellious. They didn't act like that. And now it seems like the track is that we get people to conform by telling them it's actually a form of rebellion when it's clearly not. Well, it's a form of rebellion against intelligence, but that's creativity, but that's not what you want. So.
Yeah. How can we spark the fire of creativity again?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, for people who are inclined towards creativity, you just have to ignore all of these voices and realize that no matter what you do, someone is going to pretend to be upset somewhere. So you just ignore them and live your life and create what is meaningful to you. But in regard to actually learning to becoming creative, you really have to expose yourself to lots of different things while studying one thing very deeply. So if you're studying, let's say, painting, for example, maybe you look at art house movies, sculpture, poetry, literature, and all kinds of other things that might eventually kind of go into the subconscious and gestate and create something new or spark some new idea. There's a designer, it may not mean so much now, but called Miyake, and he just creates clothing out of these heat pressed pleats in polyester, very expensive. But about 30 years ago, before anyone else, he was creating clothing out of all kinds of things like paper, moldings of plastic with natural fibers, and creating things that were inspired by origami or kimono, but also Western clothing. They created this weird sort of hybrid that are partly timeless, kind of partly tribal, partly very futuristic as well. But you can see that there's all these different elements have come together in it. And that's kind of what you need to be creative. You have to draw in these different elements, not mix them just for the sake of it, but allow things to just stay in your mind and something will come out. And, in a sense, you can't really help but allow these things to come out, even when you think they are not. So it's important to have at least wide field of knowledge or things you've seen that you can draw from that might spark your imagination. Think about these things while practicing something very deeply, at least one thing, whatever that may be, that somehow they can manifest in.
Okay. So it's a bit of a combination of the generalization and specialization.
Yeah, that's right. You need at least one thing that you're going to specialize in while looking at other things outside. And and again, in the late Japanese samurai manual, the Hagakura, which is quite a violent manual part, it says, if when you master a way, you should be able to look at other ways and be more and more in accord with your own. So if you're a master with the sword, you should be able to look at painting or even take up painting and learn more about the sword from that or other arts as well. And and you find in Japan that a master sword fighter might also be a master calligrapher, master painter as well. So, there's always this, you have to focus on one thing, but that will enable you to look at other things and improve your own art as well. So,
It also seems to me that what kind of would help, I think, is role models for people, the people who do follow that create and that
yeah.
follow their paths.
Mm.
And one of the questions I actually had that I wanted to ask you about this was who are some of your role models?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. It's especially tricky today because all of our role models are kind of dragged down and debased, really.
Mm.
Even thinking of someone like Gandhi, who, for many people is a sort of superhero and a saint. But actually, when you do a bit of digging, there are other scandals there, and
Yeah.
he's not entirely, not entirely saying, yeah, of course, no one is saying it. No one is like that, really. But so it's very difficult because all of our heroes are dragged down and debased. But yeah, that's a good question. Who would my heroes be? Yeah, I don't know if I have heroes, but I think people who've inspired me along the way. Certainly, Izzy Miyake actually inspired me many years ago. This idea of you draw on tradition, but you're innovative at the same time. That certainly inspired me when I was younger. I would say Yukio Mishima as well. He was a controversial Japanese author. I don't know if you know his writing, but he's very controversial. And but what inspired me about him is that he was kind of a weak and sickly child. I think in some respects I probably was as well. Who later on took up bodybuilding and became very muscular. And he also pushed boundaries in all kinds of ways. There are all things about him that people wouldn't like, but he was starting gangster movies. He had his own private army. I'm not saying that that's necessarily an aim of mine, but he sort of pushed the boundaries. He was Japan's really greatest literary figure of the 20th century, or certainly one of them. And but apart from pushing all these boundaries, and sometimes shocking Japanese society, I like the fact that he started off as quite weak and then built himself up and became this totally different person, became much more in his body. And I think for me, that's also been something that I've had to struggle with over the years, to be more in my body. So he would be an inspiration. And I'm sure I'm going to think of 10 other people later on, but they would be two people who've inspired me over the years.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, and I think that outside of the role models, moral exemplars,
Mm.
it also noted that we need to associate with quality and associate,
Yeah.
I think, with people of quality.
Mhm.
So it's not
Yeah.
necessarily having an individual, but just putting ourselves in an environment where
Mhm.
improving ourselves and striving for something better is also an essential component to this.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I'm lucky because I have friends who are highly intelligent. One of my closest friends who lives nearby practices martial arts. We read similar books. Most of the times we can influence each other and recommend books. So that's two things we have in common. And we have all kinds of other things, interests in common as well. So that's been, invaluable. But going back into my earlier life, when I was very rebellious when I was very young. So I started going to nightclubs when I was about 14 years old. and dressing very, very outrageously, and really outrageously. And by the time I was about 17, I was really sick of it. To be quite honest, certainly by 18, I was very much over going to nightclubs, and I reached a point really when I was around 17 that I really had to make a decision to just change all my friends. Some had drifted away already, but I felt that those who remained were just sort of pretty low quality, really. And I definitely struggled for a little while with not really having very many friends, but it was really a break I needed to make. And I've noticed that the people who can't make that break sometimes get dragged down with these people, even if they're more intelligent. You have to cut these people off, unfortunately, because they're only going to drag you down. It's not like you're going to pick them up, probably. And you have to find people that can inspire you, or you can have a good relationship with you, inspire each other. That's even better.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that and experienced something similar. Although I don't think I dressed outrageously. I used to rebel against that. I remember one of the things that I was always saying is like, and this was my critique is, hey, let's all look different together.
Yeah, that's always there for sure, for sure. Yeah, I mean, of course, that is the thing about rebellion. It always requires a kind of conformism. And then there's the playwright Quentin Crisp. I don't know if you know him. But he said young people have solved the problem of how to rebel and how to conform. They now rebel against older people and conform to each other, which is essentially true.
Yeah.
So yeah, I always get that. That is true.
Yeah, absolutely. In regards to, along the same line of uh, role models and associating with quality, doesn't this also imply in a way that we can't do all of this alone? The warrior mystic doesn't exist in isolation. And I think that this is something that is maybe something that is difficult for an American audience because our model, the primary model, I think, in the US is not necessarily the warrior mystic, but the cowboy, the rugged individual who does it all and alone, does it all alone.
Yeah.
But community is important, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and obviously there were communities of cowboys and people around them, panhandlers, whatever it was. But sure, the sort of archetypal modern image of the cowboy is the sort of Clint Eastwood figure who comes out of the nature, out of the wilderness alone to take down the corrupt gunfighters. But yeah, it's absolutely, and this is one of the enormous transformations of our society. We don't really understand the implications of it, probably. That even if you have to go back to the 1970s, I think it was 2/3 of Americans were still attending club meetings regularly. And of course, today people think, oh, club's boring. Whatever it might be, some kind of ethical club or club for women or club for men or whatever. But that means you really have most of society interacting with each other and with people that you might not otherwise come into contact with as well. Around where I live, there's actually a lot of Greek soccer supporting clubs, and I would imagine that, of course, they're all Greek, but I would imagine that they all have different professions and may not otherwise meet each other. From 1985 to 1994, there was, I think, 45% drop in club attendance. And then you think, of course, as well about the drop in church attendance, which I believe is declining in America and is set to decline very rapidly over the next few decades. It won't be that different to Europe. In Great Britain, church attendance now it's only about 5%. I would think most of those, or a substantial percentage of that 5%, are foreigners as well, people who emigrated to Great Britain. And bear in mind that England has its own Church of England as well, its own official church. That's horrendous. I'm not a Christian, but we're becoming more and more isolated. You cannot achieve very much by yourself. Let's think of yoga. You can't really learn yoga in a vacuum. You need some kind of school. You definitely can't learn martial arts by yourself. You need a school. You can learn things, that's true, but there's going to come a point when you have to learn with other people or gain something from other people. And sometimes, of course, that can be done outside of universities. It's not always necessary to go to a university, but it will nevertheless require you to come in contact and strike up some kind of relationship with people in a particular field that you're going to study. It's it can't be done otherwise. And I think a part of it is the knowledge you gain, but I think also the part of it is also coming across people who have achieved some degree of mastery that may act a little differently to other people, whether that's a yoga master, a master in martial arts, a master in painting or poetry or whatever it might be. Hopefully they're exemplifying a kind of spirit as well, not just technical sophistication, but that hopefully they've used this art to improve themselves, and that's also shining through. So that's also what you want to come into contact with.
So it's something that the individual would have to seek out.
Yeah, most of the time, yeah. I mean, there may be coincidences where somebody mentions it to you. I mean, that can happen, but most of the time you're going to need to seek it out. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so like a fraternity or a dojo, things like that.
Yeah, definitely. And they can all vary from one group of guys to the next, even within the same, let's say, martial arts school or fraternity. So it may require a little bit of looking around as well.
Do you think that people will recognize eventually that they do need the support of others for their own self-development?
I think so. I would think as society changes over the next few years, and I think we might be heading into harder times, the people are going to wake up to the fact that they do need people around them just for survival as much as anything else. And I would assume with the whole COVID situation, a lot of people probably found out who their friends were as well during that time when they were, maybe those people who were finding themselves in difficult situations, and who could they rely on at that point? Maybe no one in some cases. So I think that other people in relationships are going to become more important, and hopefully that will be offline real world relationships. But I think as a general rule, it would be good if Americans and other people were much more engaged in communities and engaged in doing things, whether it's martial arts or some kind of art class or martial art, yoga, or whatever it may be, and being more present in the world and in their own bodies in a sense as well.
Yeah. And I think that I can see a struggle in all of this. I agree with everything you're saying. And I know that this was spelled out, and you're probably referring to this. I think the author was Putnam, who wrote Bowling Alone, that marked all of this decline in social activities. But I think that a lot of people would respond that life right now in the 21st century doesn't really permit them to engage in this. And it seems like there has to be this sort of, I kind of want to call it a creative revolution, where people are like, enough is enough. We do need to come together.
That's right. Absolutely. Yeah. And we do, because we need to, for a few reasons. One, we really need to be around other people just for our own emotional stability. When you think of the percentage of people on, antidepressants in this country, I think it's something like 13%. It might even be more than that. And in terms of prescription drugs, I believe around 50% of America is on prescription drugs at any in any 30-day period. I mean, there is no reason for that. And a lot of, not everything, but a lot of these problems could be solved by getting out into nature, healthy diet, being around other people that actually uplift you instead of being in this state of anxiety and criticism all the time, which is having an effect on the body. So we need to be around other people for our health, but in nature for our health a little bit as well. But for our society to function, I think we really have to get back to a point where we meet other people that may hold the opposite views to us, and we're able to think, oh, this man is a beast and an enemy and must be possessed by Satan. But well, maybe he has his own life experiences and his own problems. He's probably not motivated by pure evil or ignorance. I don't know about him or her. Maybe I should at least try and empathize and discover who they are, so at least I can have a bigger picture of what's going on and be more empathetic.
Yeah, absolutely. And perhaps stop making assumptions about others and thinking that we automatically know everything that someone thinks or feels or believes based on just a couple of statements. To sit and be present and listen. Right.
Yeah. That's, of course, that's one of the worst things. Not only thinking that we know everything about them from a couple of statements, but judging everybody by the worst thing they've ever done. You know, they could be a saint practically, and then they said something 10 years ago, and now they're considered persona non grata.
Right.
And it's a weird thing, and I think in other societies, maybe too much, you could argue that people were elevated. We admired people who did great things and kind of maybe let not so good stuff slide by the wayside, whereas now it's the inverse. And both have their failings, but I think always seeing the worst in people is by far the worst failing of the two. So, and also then it means there's no potential to ascend, because who's your example? There is no example.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I was reflecting on this yesterday when I was hiking. I hike every Friday. I consider that my spiritual practice.
Yeah.
And I was thinking in terms of the people that we've lost, not necessarily by death, but by being ostracized from the creative community because of past sins. And, that I would still like to have some of their creations, and I hope that at some point they can return to us in some way.
Yeah.
But what it reminds me of also is going back to Nietzsche, what he wrote about in the genealogy of morals is this idea of resentment, or I think resentment, that people are going after someone for, a moral failing, which are legitimate moral failings, but completely eradicating them from our culture.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's very dangerous, unfortunately. I mean, I think that we do at some point need to ignore this and maybe, just create whatever we want to create regardless. And maybe there has to be alternative ways of showing art or alternative media stations, whatever it is. But certainly we cannot give in to this sort of anti-creative, moralistic, really sort of mob, tries to control everything. They've never contributed anything to society themselves. So.
Yeah, it's the herd mentality.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, totally.
I know we're starting to run out of time here, but I wanted to ask about women because the focus on your book, it's really about men, but it seems to me that everything you write could also apply to women as well.
Yeah. I mean, there's a couple of things about sex which may be a little bit strange for women to get their heads around, but I would say probably 98% of the book could also apply to women. And I would say that my philosophy isn't that women should be in the kitchen and men should be making war. My philosophy is actually that men and women should do the same things, but there may be a difference in proportion. So let's say martial arts. I think both men and women should learn a martial art or self-defense. Maybe the guy, and I'm not saying this in every single case, but let's just say in general, men want to be more muscular. Women probably don't want to be more muscular. So it's just a matter of proportion in that case. But it is good if women can be strong as well and defend themselves. Very good. So I would recommend that. And yeah, and other things, really everything in the book could apply to women, because it's more about proportion than about, this is man's work and this is women's work. Because I don't really see things as that. Because the whole thing is about bringing these two different aspects together, the sort of peaceful and the martial together, the creative and the physical. So certainly, yeah. So if women want to read this book and with the more male language, then I would definitely encourage them and to take on board the same lessons and just think about proportion. Proportion is something we don't think about much in society, but that'll really be the only difference. So, yeah.
Right. Yeah, I was thinking specifically about a friend of mine who likes to work with various goddesses in terms of like sort of energetically, and but yet she's never looked, as far as I know, at like Athena. And I was also thinking in India, there are some really good examples that would fit this archetype, like Durga,
right,
and Kali to an extent as well.
Kali, yeah.
That there are models of female warriors.
Yeah, sure. And Kali actually, there's a martial art in India called Kalari Payan, which is like a very energetic form of kung fu, lots of leaping in the air. But traditionally in the Hindu Kalari Payan temples, they would have a 7-storied altar, and at the top would be a statue of Kali. So you find this sort of, again, the mystical and the martial, and in this case, the female as well. So. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I do encourage everyone to get a copy of your book and read it. I found it very insightful, and like I said, so much of it resonated.
Great. Thank you.
My own thinking. My only regret is that I only had the time to read it once before speaking. But let me ask just two final questions.
Sure.
What's next for you?
Good question. So I'm always working on a few different things. I think one of two things I'm going to work on next is either a book on more practical on hypnosis, meditation, that kind of thing, or I'm going to write a book on America, one of the two. Although I have also written a lengthy prose poem, sort of the cross between Khalil Gibran's The Prophet and Nietzsche's Das Spek Zarathustra, so that might be out before then. But I think it would be one of the two, either a book on hypnosis, meditation, the consciousness, ordering the consciousness, or on America. So we'll see.
Okay. All right. Well, I look forward to those. That all sounds very interesting. So how can people find out more about you and your work?
Yeah, so they can go to my website, angelmillar.com, ANGELMILLAR.com, and they can find I write a lot of articles that they can find on there, a little bit about my books, a little bit about hypnosis and mentoring as well. So pretty much the whole thing. Obviously, my books are in Amazon, Barnes & Noble, IndieBound, and all those other good places. So.
Okay. All right. Wonderful. I will put a link to your website and to your books, at least the recent one and the Initiatic book in the show notes and in the video description on YouTube.
Awesome. Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, Angel, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciated being able to speak with you. And there's a lot more I think I could talk to you about. I know there was a lot we didn't get into, but I didn't want to give away everything in your book either.
Oh, no. Yeah, it's great speaking with you, definitely. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Okay, well, thank you so much. And that's a wrap on episode 21 of Rebel Spirit Radio. Thank you so much for listening or watching if you are part of my YouTube audience. If you enjoyed this podcast, please make sure to give it a positive rating on whatever platform you use to listen to podcasts. It only takes a second, and your 5-star ratings really do help.
If you have a minute to spare, please consider writing a short but positive review. And please consider subscribing. For those viewing on YouTube, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Make sure you hit that notification bell so you will be informed when I upload new content. I've been releasing episodes weekly and would like to continue doing so. I'm also working on creating additional video content for the YouTube channel, including more book reviews, educational videos on topics concerning spirituality, the history of religion, and the religious response to the climate crisis. But that extra content takes a lot of time and work. If you would like to support me in creating free and credible material on YouTube and continuing with this podcast, please consider making a one-time donation via PayPal. You can find a link for that in the video description or show notes. Your support makes my work possible. I'm Nick Mather, and you've been listening to Rebel Spirit Radio. Until next time, may you be in peace, may you flourish in all possible ways, and may you continue to nurture your rebel spirit.